river by the old mill run, the lazy, lazy river in the noonday sun, lingered in the shade of a candle tree.
Honest fisherman, I would like to meet one. I think that it would be a unique experience. In fact, I doubt if one exists. I think that they are a figment of somebody's imagination.
Hello, this is Hoagy Carmichael. In 1983, just 6 months before Alfred Miller's Sparse Grey Hackle died, I decided to film my friend, and so we went to Norriton Heights, which is in Connecticut, where Sparse lived with his wife, Louise, and I spent 3 or 4 days over there with him. He was getting on, as you'll see. He was slowing down. He was 90, but he perked up for this filming, and I thought was able to remember a number of things that I hope would be good for the history and give us all an idea of who was Sparse Grey Hackle.
I'm a reporter, definitely. I have never, a writer is a man of imagination who conceives of a plot, whatever it may be.
As you'll see, Sparse is in his usual 3-piece suit configuration with a vest. He always wore that in the summer, I swear in the spring, and quite often with long underwear on, by the way. Sparse wore his 3-piece suit with a tie. That's what he did. That's the way you went through life. I remember walking in one day. Sparse wanted to smoke a pipe. He had marvelous pipes from a firm called Freiberg and Trier, but his dentures wouldn't allow it, so he took up cigar smoking. And one day I walked in, and he was sitting in his red leather chair where he normally read, and his cigar had fallen down, and his vest was on, well, not on fire, but it was smoldering. He was sound asleep. I went over and tamped him down and suggested maybe take the vest off. Oh, no, he wasn't going to do that. So we spent the rest of the afternoon talking whatever it was, and he kept his little vest on with a few holes in it that had not been there 4 hours earlier.
In those early days, opening day was simply a good excuse to get drunk. Colder than all bloody hell up there. The very earliest go back to before the coming of the brown trout. They're original, the indigenous fish in the beaver kill in those Catskill streams. It wasn't a trout at all, it was a char. And Salvelinus fontinalis, the salmon of the fountains. Oh, there were plenty of perfectly ethical fishermen who kept 5-inch fish. It was an unusual experience to get those little brook trout more than about 6 inches long, and were a number of very ethical fishermen who said, well, what the hell, that's all the big they are. Let's catch them and keep them. Don't forget that I was born in 1892. I wasn't 18 years old until 1910. So that I don't go back to the very earliest days when the Antrim Lodge was over the other side of the railroad tracks. But in my time, the bar down in the Antrim Lodge would be completely filled with fishermen, all of them with their waders and boots and so forth, still on, crowding their way up to the bar to get a drink and then guarding it with both hands. The tobacco smoke you could cut and stack, and the noise was, I couldn't be measured in decibels. But there was everybody would meet, and it didn't take very much to drive them in there because it was damn good and cold. I was always crazy about fishing. And the next best thing to doing it yourself is reading about it, and the next best thing to that is writing about it. Or maybe you can reverse those last two.
When he was discharged from the war, he went to work for the Wall Street Journal, for their Boston bureau. And then later he took over what was essentially a one-man public relations firm.
I had a succession of what you might call one-man businesses after I set up business myself. My business in Wall Street was that I was a public relations man. I never worked for Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal, but I had them for clients. And I'd go around the street and talk to brokers and one thing or another like that, and then I'd go in and file a column. I don't know how I got into writing. In the first place, I attended a high school which was far ahead of its time.
Sparse was born in Brooklyn and went to a very good high school there. He was the captain of his debating team, which should surprise no one. Believe me, he was a marvelous storyteller, great raconteur, and of course, as we all know, a wonderful writer. One of those guys who could put ideas on paper. Not a lot of people could do it. When the Great War broke out, he joined the ambulance corps and went to France and drove an ambulance around for several years. He loved to tell stories about that experience. I don't quite know why. I heard them many, many, many times, usually the same story too, which was good. Another client appeared under the name of the American Time Machine Company and run by a young man by the name of Watson. It became IBM, and Sparse, I don't know exactly how many years, but it must have been 45, 50 years. Sparse was associated with IBM, and they always, to their credit, they always took care of Sparse till the week he died. Sparse started to write portions of columns for angling papers. Red Smith was a good friend of his, the great Herald Tribune reporter. And as Sparse will tell you, he was able quite often to give them a piece, a small idea, an idea that they could build a column on.
Oh, I used to write the columnists, and something you had in yesterday. Columnists are always hard up for lead copy suggestions, something to touch them off, because they've got to write the Red Smith and fellows like that have to come up with what you might call a personality piece every day or 3 times a week or whatever you please, so that if they have anybody who can give them an idea of any sort, even a meretricious one, why, it's just what they want, because that's their platform to dive off and say, well, Sparse Grey Hackle doesn't know what he's talking about because, or something of that sort. And he can go along for his allotted piece that big, and says, well, that's today's piece. Now I don't have to get up another one until tomorrow.
Sparse was admitted to this club in 1931, nominated by his boss, Mr. Van Dyke. Within a year, less actually, he was writing for the Bulletin, which is the house organ, comes out 3 to 4 times a year. And he was writing under the nom de plume of Sparse Grey Hackle.
2 of the oldest flies in existence, both wet and dry, originally wet, of course, were the brown hackle and the gray hackle. And there's somewhere along the very early part of my contact with the sport, somebody started the idea that you had to tie them sparse, that you put too many feathers on the fly and it didn't resemble an insect, and all that sort of thing. So you had to have it sparse. Well, I had gray hair when I was 16 years old. Some of it, I've always had gray hair. So that was easy enough for me to come onto the Grey Hackle. And as I say, the fad then was for a very sparse tie, so I called it Sparse Grey Hackle. And then I began to have a few guys. And geez, there were some pretty tough guys in that game in the old racket days. And I said, here, I might just as well cover my identity a little bit and use a pen name. And besides, it was kind of fashionable, too. So I called myself Sparse Grey Hackle.
Well, nobody in this club knew who that was. He was a young new member, and but these articles were there, and they were well written. And it wasn't for a number of years before Sparse finally told everybody that it was he. That's the way he was. He was very self-effacing. He wrote some marvelous articles, of course, about Theodore Gordon, the Leonard Rods, Garrison, some humorous, some historical.
Got out the whole damn bulletin by myself, practically. But I never would take the job of editor or take any formal connection with it. So I claimed that gave me freedom to do whatever I pleased. And anytime I wanted to tell them to go to hell, I could do it without having a meeting of the board. Besides which, I didn't have to report to anybody, which was a great saving of time.
I am standing in front of the rare book collection at the Anglers Club of New York, and I promise you there are some fantastic books back there, several of which are one of a kind. One of the books that we have is a marvelous, marvelous, almost pristine copy, belonged to Lewis Hull, of Sparse's book, Fishless Days. This was done for the club in 1954, a wonderful collection of Sparse's story. And it is the precursor to the book that most people know, which is Fishless Days and Angling Nights.
I got out a succession of half books. The original one was just called Fishless Days. And it was just for the members of the Angler Club. And then I took part of that. Nick Lyons came somewhere into the picture. He persuaded Crown, and they took 40% of Fishless Days, and I wrote a few more pieces for it, and they brought it out as Fishless Days, Angling Nights, by Sparse Grey Hackle.
I met Sparse by looking for him. I had read his story, Murder, in one of the very good anthologies. I met a woman who knew him, asked for his real name, because it couldn't be Sparse, and then wrote to an Alfred W. Miller, whom I found easily enough. And he said that he had a book called Fishless Days. I promptly looked that up and said I liked it, and said, are there a few more pieces that you could add? Then we met for lunch. We met at the Anglers Club, and he talked for about 2 hours and was puffing away on his pipe. And I had a cigar then, and we were both burning in several places, but the stories went on and on and on. And I said, well, you really must give me the right to do the rest of these stories, and we'll make a little book out of it and call it Fishless Days, Angling Nights. I was with Crown Publishers at the time, and I had just started what I immodestly called Sportsman's Classic Series, and had already published Flick, Marinaro, Jennings, Swisher Richards, and several others, and had some credibility with Crown. I asked them if we could do a collection of stories, which was not a practical book, And they said yes. I got the manuscript from Sparse, loved it, wrote him a long letter saying, are these contract terms all right? Sparse said they look fine to him. And then the editor-in-chief at Crown got very skittish and didn't get back to me, despite repeated requests, for about 7 months. Whereupon I got a letter where Sparse changed his salutation to me from Nick to Mr. Lyons, and wrote a blistering letter saying that if they don't think enough of me to write back promptly, I don't want to publish with them. And I think I have that letter someplace. I cajoled Sparse, we talked, we got around to first names again, and finally he signed the contract and we got the book started. His writing is unique in a number of different ways. I think part of it is the clarity. He was very precise. And there's one very amusing story of Sports Illustrated changing a reference to L. Tappan Fairchild, once writing about an olive nymph that he had deigned to use. Sports Illustrated didn't know what it was, so they changed it to live nymph. Sparse said it was the most libelous change of one letter in the history of the English language, and he never wrote for them again. He did have precision, and he also had an old-time grace that you don't find in much writing today. He didn't try to be clever, but he could often be witty. He would speak about a boy rising to chocolate bars all day. But he would not do what so many of the modern writers do, speak in a different language. His language had a purity to it, a directness to it. There was not more description than there should be. He was not displaying something for someone. He was trying to convey a moment and a story and a point of view, an attitude toward fishing that, to a good extent, I have seen vanish from much of the groups of fishermen that I have met in the last 20 years. I think one of the things I like about Sparse's writings also is his modesty. He does not claim ever to be a writer of particular strength. The best he ever said of himself was, just a good reporter, bub. And as to his fishing, I fished with him. He had a lovely left-handed cast that looked like it went to the right place, and I'm sure he got his fish in his time, but he was not a big fisherman. His admiration for Ed Hewitt's club, where there were no braggarts, so he said, where there was a gentlemanly connection to fly fishing, was something that he endorsed and embodied in his own life.
Well, I was a lousy fisherman. I still am. In the first place, you have to have more eyesight than I have ever had. And in the second place, you have a chance to, you need the chance to fish at the time when the fish are there and taking. There's nothing going on in a trout stream in August, for instance. And that would be after all my other clients had taken off and gone off on their vacations and so forth. By that time, it was August, when nobody wanted to go anywhere or to be in town or anything else. So that was left for me.
Edward Ringwood Hewitt, a longtime member of the Anglers Club of New York, was a very good friend of Sparse's. Sparse used to go up to the Big Bend Club, where Mr. Hewitt's private waters were on the Neversink, and he fished with him for years and years and years. Mr. Hewitt was a lot of things. He was a wonderful writer. He obviously was a great angler, but he was a tinkerer.
There was never anybody like Ed Hewitt. Ed was, he was a descendant of old Peter Cooper. And as a matter of fact, the foundation of the family fortune was the Chrysler building. His family owned the ground that the Chrysler building stood on.
Mr. Hewitt was a very, very good machinist.
In his townhouse in Gramercy Park, he had a regular machine shop.
And one of the things he really enjoyed making was trout reels for his friends. I think he made 22 of them. This particular one, owned by the club, was made for his friend Charles Curlee in 1954, and it is beautifully made. A raised pillar, as you can see, had a roller there for the line guard, really. And then on the back, Mr. Curlee's name all etched in there, but there's an adjustable drag lever here. This has an extremely nice and proud click, as you can see, made of aluminum, and obviously a marvelous, marvelous collecting item for anybody interested in American trout reels and, of course, Mr. Hewitt.
I have heard many stories about how difficult Sparse was to work with. To me, he was unfailingly easy, except for the difficulty in the contract, and except for any moments when you might have been rude to him, and I can't remember any when I was rude to him. He was unfailingly pleasant and kind, always a little laughter in his talk, and always a sense that we were both engaged in a very happy activity, writing, finding the words for something that we both loved.
Lady Beaverkill, Louise Brewster Miller. I therefore dedicate this book in memory of our bright hours of angling together. I have always dedicated my books to my wife. Mama can fish your pants off about 7/8 of all the men you meet on the stream. My wife, she can fish like a hawk. Never saw anybody to beat her.
When Fishless Days finally did come out, I told Sparse that I was going to bet him a dime that the book would go into a second printing by Christmas. This was in August. I don't remember the year exactly. We printed 7,500 copies, which was an awful lot, and Sparse said it was not possible. We could not possibly sell that many. We would be eating them in a very short period of time. December came, or November came, and we needed to reprint the book. It was out of stock. So I called up Sparse, and I think we were going to have lunch. I said, Sparse, we're reprinting the book. Do you have any corrections to make? He was very silent, and he said, you're idiots. You cannot possibly sell that many books. I said, Sparse, 7,500 have been sold, and we're going to print, I believe, another 5,000 as a second printing. And he came to lunch that day, and I said, Sparse, you owe me 10 cents. Can I have it, please? And Sparse said, you'll get it, bub. Every time I'd see him or write to him, I'd say, Sparse, I like to collect my debts. Where is my dime? And he'd say, you'll get it. Sparse came in late April and simply put a package on my desk and said, I always pay my Buster, I always pay my debts. And then left. And I opened the package, and it was a copy of the edition of Fishless Days, Angling Nights that I had published, and he had embedded the dime, or had him by a fine bookbinder, had the dime embedded in the jacket in the green Moroccan leather with the inscription, for Nick, who made this book. And it is one of my prized possessions today.
I used to walk up, 4 or 5 miles up Bedford Avenue to look at all the sporting goods windows. So one day, there was a penny candy store, sort of a place, and they had a rod in the window. And I went in and said, "How much is it?" And they said 50 cents. Well, that was in my league. All these things, boxcar prices like $5 and $10 were ridiculous, but gee, 50 cents. And I went home, I asked my father for 50 cents, the only time that I remember ever asking my father for money. And we were all desperately poor. My father worked 7 days a week. It was one of the old Christian clothing companies, Smith Grain Company. Well, the owner of Smith Grain Company was Millard F. Smith. Young Millard was a little bit sickly, and the doctor recommended that he eat prunes. Little Millard Smith didn't like prunes and said so. So his loving father or grandfather or whoever it was said, "I will give you $1 for every 5 prunes that you eat." And my father came back full of that story. And my father says, "Well, the prunes are good for little Millard Smith. They ought to be good for you. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you 5 cents for every 8 prunes that you eat." And then I made a big mistake because I figured that I would have that 50 cents by nightfall. And no matter of eating 50 prunes or something like that was going to stop me. So my father hastily added with a limit of 5 cents a week. So I saved my money. After a few falls from grace, I finally made my 50 cents. And I went up and bought this noble rod and brought it home and took pieces of paper, cut them in the shape of fish with a hole in them where the eye would be. And then we had lived like everybody else in a flat in Brooklyn in those days. It was a straight-through flat, and it had a kitchen with a bathroom alongside of it. So I went and stood out in the kitchen, and then I took this rod and put it together and put a hook and, of course, a sinker on it. You always had to have a sinker. You had to use the big one. And I put it in there and caught the paper fish out of the bathtub. And that is the story of the prune rod.
His legacy is going to be something that is not written today. It has grace, care, form, structure, a deep love of fly fishing, of the activity itself, a love of the characters he writes about. Sparse is not a trout bum. Sparse is a trout gentleman, and he only was interested in 1 or 2 species, so far as I know. He did not like salmon fishing. He's not going to tell you a great deal about how to catch more fish, but he does tell you a bit about how to live and how to respond to the activity of fly fishing, which is so lovely and has given me so much pleasure. I don't know anyone who writes like Sparse today, and I think that the care that he gave, the small body of work that he left, is like little jewels that are not going to lose their luster.
Everyone's in love, up a lazy river, how happy you could be. Up a lazy river with thee. Oh, up a lazy river by the old mill run. The lazy, lazy river in the noonday sun. Lingered in the shade of a kind old tree. Throw away your troubles, dream a dream with me.